She buried her husband on a Thursday in November, in a grave cut by hand into peat and stone above the Western Sea. Before that month was over, 3 different people had tried to take the Croft from her, and every one of them believed the same thing. A woman alone could not survive a Hebridean winter. What none of them understood was that Mary Sinclair had already decided what she would do when the cold came. Not because she was fearless, not because she was certain, but because on the last clear night of his life, Ewan Sinclair had taken her wrist in a hand already burning with fever, and said, "Don't hand Macaulay the lease. Don't let them say they knew." There was nothing poetic about it. No grand speech, no promise of heaven. Just a dying man, on a rented strip of Atlantic ground, trying to keep one last defeat from becoming the story everyone remembered about him. Mary understood exactly what he meant. She had only been on that Croft 6 months. She was 31, from Inverness, raised in a row house where the rain came sideways, but never with the violence of Western Islands. She had married Ewan in the spring of 1892, because he could look at a pile of rotten timbers, storm-bent nails, and one spare henhouse, and describe a future inside it so clearly that it sounded less like hope and more like a set of measurements. Ewan was a joiner. A good one. He could straighten a warped door, re-rib a fishing skiff, patch a roofline by eye. What he could not do was accurately measure the distance between a beautiful plan and an Atlantic winter. He underestimated how hard the wind could hit a low hill above Loch Carloway. He underestimated how quickly wet cold could get into timber, into feed, into bone. And he underestimated how fast bad water could turn a healthy body into a dying one. The fever took him in 9 days. By the 4th, he could barely keep broth down. By the 6th, he drifted in and out, speaking in broken fragments about hens, lease papers, driftwood beans, and accounts he had meant to settle. By the 9th, he was clear again in the frightening way the dying sometimes become clear. As if the body, for one cruel hour, gives everything back just so it can be taken properly. That was when he looked at Mary and said, "Don't hand Macaulay the lease." He died before dawn. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She had fallen asleep sitting upright beside the bed, her hand wrapped around his. When she woke, the room was blue with first light, and the pressure in his fingers was gone. That was how she knew. Not by looking at him. Not by searching for breath. The hand was still warm. It simply no longer answered hers. She sat beside him for 20 minutes. Then she stood, took the spade from the wall, and went outside because there was no one else to dig. The neighbors came for the burial, such as it was. A crofter named Ian Brodie from half a mile inland. The McCraes from the next rise over. Reverend Alastair Kerr from the kirk in the village, broad-shouldered and damp-eyed and genuinely kind in the way kind men often are when they do not yet understand the shape of the danger. Morag Dalziel came in her pony cart from the harbor store, sitting perfectly straight in a black wool coat buttoned to the throat, and Sine MacLeod came last, climbing down slow from a cart that looked older than some marriages. They stood around the grave while Mary read from the family Bible Ewan had brought west in a tin-lined trunk. The sea moved below the hill in a hard slate line. The wind never truly stopped, and when it was over, people began to leave in the order of their own discomfort. Duncan Macaulay waited. Mary had noticed him during the service. 40 years old, broad through the chest, a face worn by weather and opportunism in almost equal measure. He did not look at the coffin much. He looked at the Croft, at the stone boundary wall, at the half-finished byre, at the hen run, at the narrow strip of south-facing slope behind the house where Ewan had said, in spring, that they might someday build something useful. Duncan looked at land the way other men looked at cards. He waited until the others had drifted toward their carts. Then he came over, holding his cap in front of him like a courtesy he had borrowed for the occasion. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, "I hate to speak of practical matters today, but Ewan owed me £2.08. Under the circumstances, I'd be willing to treat that as an advance against the lease if you're thinking of relinquishing." Mary looked at him. Not with shock. Not even with grief. She looked at him with a cold clarity that had begun 9 nights earlier and had not left since. "Mr. Macaulay," she said, "you are standing within sight of my husband's open grave, and speaking to me about rent." He started to answer. She did not raise her voice. "I will remember where you were standing when you said it." Something changed in Duncan's face then. Not shame. Men like Duncan did not waste much time on shame. More like recalculation. He put his cap back on, nodded once, and walked away. Reverend Kerr appeared at her side almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for Duncan to clear. "Mary," he said softly, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder, "the Lord doesn't ask us to carry trials alone. Morrison's boarding house in Stornoway could use help through the winter. You could keep the lease in your name and return in spring." It was kind advice, which made it dangerous. Because in that moment, kindness and surrender were the same thing. "Reverend," Mary said, "Ewan is Barry here. I'm not leaving him to weather alone." She said it gently. He did not deserve the edge she had used on Duncan. But she said it in a tone that ended the conversation. The last person to leave was Sine MacLeod, had one hand on her mule's harness, and was about to climb up, when she turned and looked at the Croft with the expression of a woman deciding whether silence would count as cruelty. "You'll come and see me tomorrow," she said. It was not quite an invitation. Mary nodded. "I will." 3 days later, Sine came instead. She arrived while Mary was outside nailing scrap boards over the gaps in the henhouse wall. The Atlantic wind came straight through the old structure. The boards wouldn't save it. Mary knew that. But doing something useless was still better than standing still. Sine watched her hammer twice, maybe 3 times. "That won't hold," she said. Mary drove another nail. "I know, but sitting down will kill me quicker." Sine's mouth moved very slightly, not into a smile, but into the shape of approval that sometimes stands where a smile would. "In the far north," she said, "I once heard of hens kept below the frost line in a chamber dug into earth and banked with turf. The cold above never reached them. The ground keeps its own temperature if you go deep enough." Mary stopped hammering. Sine kept going. It wasn't warmth alone. That was the clever part. Warmth keeps them alive. Light keeps them laying. There was a glazed hatch on the south side. Maybe glass, maybe mica, maybe both. Low winter light, carried down into the chamber. Enough to confuse the body into thinking the season hadn't turned fully against it. Mary stared at her. "You're telling me to bury my hens. I'm telling you there may be a way to keep them producing through winter. Have you done it?" Sine met her eyes. "No." "You've seen it?" "No." "What have you seen?" "I heard of it from a Norwegian at a supper in Portree 20 years ago. He swore he'd seen it done on a croft farther north than any place sensible people choose to live." The wind moved hard through the boards. 18 hens. That was what Mary had. Not many by rich standards. Everything by hers. If they stopped laying, the few coins still coming in would stop. If the coins stopped, Duncan's £2.08 would stop being a nuisance and become leverage. And leverage in Duncan Macaulay's hands was the one thing Ewan had explicitly asked her not to allow. Mary looked at the hens. Then at Sine. "When do we start?" That night, with the lamp turned low and the house carrying the raw emptiness that follows a fresh death, Mary opened Ewan's notebook. He had left sketches everywhere. Skiffs, door frames, shelves, a feed bin he meant to build in spring. On the last blank pages, Mary began to draw. Not upward, down. A chamber sunk 7 feet into the south-facing bank behind the Croft, where the slope would shed rain away from the entrance. A narrow stair. A low roof framed with salvaged boat ribs and driftwood beams. Turf packed thick above it. An inner hanging of canvas to catch the rush of cold when the outer door opened. Nest boxes on the east wall. On the west, a glazed hatch set at a winter angle to catch whatever thin southern light a Hebridean sky was willing to spare. She stared at the drawing for a long time. It was crude, not elegant, but it had the unmistakable feeling of something possible. That mattered more than beauty. Before dawn the next morning, Mary took a spade, a short-handled pick, and Ewan's measuring string up the bank and drove iron into earth. At first the peat gave easily. Below that came heavier soil, then stone, then a packed layer that fought every blow. She worked in freezing wind with her coat open, because sweat was as dangerous as cold if it stayed trapped in the cloth. She worked until her palms split. She wrapped them and kept digging. She ate oat bread standing. She slept in bursts. She stopped measuring the task by completion and started measuring it by not quitting that day. On the 5th day, Morag DL arrived from the harbor. Morag was 48 and had spent 20 years running the store that supplied half the district with lamp oil, sugar, mails, flour, and the kind of hard judgment people pretended they didn't buy from her but clearly did. She remained seated in the cart. That was deliberate. Mary noticed deliberate things. "I imagine," Morag called, "you've had time to think more practically." Mary climbed out of the hole and walked to the fence. "I have." "Then you know the sensible thing is to lock the house, take service in town, and come back in April when the wind has remembered how to behave." "I have hens," Mary said. "And the lease. And enough meal for a while yet." Morag looked past her at the half-dug pit in the bank. "By January, your hens will stop. By February, the feed will be worth more than the birds. And by March, this whole place will belong to whichever man keeps the neatest accounts." There was no malice in it. That was the problem. Morag believed she was describing physics. "Have you ever been wrong about someone surviving winter?" Mary asked. Morag's answer came without hesitation. "Not once." "Then this will be your first." For a moment, the two women held one another in a silence too exact to be called awkward. Then Morag nodded very slightly, as if acknowledging not agreement but a fact of opposition, and turned the cart back toward the village. On the 8th day, Mary hit a seam of hard stone under the peat. The pick glanced off. The shock ran through her wrists into her teeth. She stood in the half-finished pit, looked up at the rectangle of gray sky above her, and thought of Ewan on summer evenings when repair jobs went bad. He never attacked the wood straight on once he knew it was resisting. He studied the grain. He found the weak line. He turned the problem until it stopped being the problem he thought he had. Mary knelt, scraped back the dirt, found the line where stone met softer soil, and drove the pick at an angle instead of head-on. The seam opened. Not easily, but it opened. That was enough. The second week, the chamber was full depth. By the end of the third, it had a roof, boat ribs for the curve, driftwood braces, heather and packed turf above, a narrow south-facing entrance with 2 doors, a hanging canvas thrown between them to keep the inner air from being ripped away by every gust. The glazed hatch was the last thing she needed. Ewan had once shown her the ruins of an abandoned excise cottage 2 miles south, nearer the cliffs, roof gone, walls half standing. He had said it the way he said most observations that seemed unimportant until much later. "There's still window glass there, if anyone's willing to take it out carefully." Mary walked there in cutting wind, found the frame, freed one intact pane cracked only at the edge, and carried it back wrapped in 2 feed sacks and her own shawl. She whitewashed the stones beneath the hatch to throw the light deeper once it entered. She spent 2 full mornings tracking the winter sun with stakes and string the way Ewan once tracked tide marks on a boathouse repair. Then she set the glass low and slanting, facing the thin southern reach. On the day she finished, Duncan Macaulay returned, this time with a parish clerk. The clerk carried a folded paper with an official seal and the expression of a man who hoped respectability might spare him from being recognized as a coward. Mrs. Sinclair, Duncan said, there's the matter of debt and improvements on lease ground. If the factor believes the property is being altered without means to support the tenancy, Ewan borrowed £2.08 from you, Mary said evenly. Unsecured. I have it in his hand, on paper. The clerk opened his mouth. I will ride to Stornoway on Monday with that paper, she went on, and with the names of everyone present when the money changed hands. If either of you would like to explain to the factor why you arrived at a widow's door with false leverage in the 3rd week after burial, you may do that there. The clerk looked at Duncan. Duncan did not look angry. He looked interested. That unsettled her more. Another time then, he said, with the faintest trace of a smile that never reached his eyes. They left, and Mary understood something clearly as she watched them go. This was no longer only about surviving, it was about record. Every egg she sold would be more than food, more than money, it would be evidence. She moved the hens into the chamber on the first Monday of December. One by one, protesting loudly, offended by the staircase, offended by the straw, offended by the entire insult of a changed arrangement. By evening they had found the perches, the chamber smelled of earth, straw, feathers, and the faint mineral coolness of the whitewashed stone under the hatch. Above ground, the wind shouted; below ground, it became a distant condition rather than an enemy. The first morning, there were no eggs. The second, none. The third, none. 4th day, snow came in off the sea in hard sideways sheets and piled against the outer door. Mary dug it clear with her bare hands, because she had left the shovel at the house, and going back felt, in that moment, like the kind of surrender that spreads. Still no eggs. On the 6th evening, she sat at the table staring at her own drawing while the lamp guttered and the house creaked with cold. The hatch was angled correctly, the chamber stayed above freezing. The birds were eating, sleeping, alert. So why were the boxes empty? Because warmth was not the question. Light was. And what if 6 weak hours of winter light were not enough to fool a body built to know the season better than people did? That night the wind rose. By midnight the thatch hissed under sleet. Mary could not sleep. She pulled on her coat, took an oil lamp, and walked out into the dark. The inner air of the chamber met her face, like the breath of an animal. Not hot, not comfortable, but alive. All 18 hens were sleeping. Not huddled in distress, not stiff with cold. Sleeping deeply, feathers loosened, bodies settled. The chamber worked well enough to hold life. Mary sat on an overturned bucket in the straw with the lamp between her boots and let herself think, for the first time, about what would happen if this was all wrong. If Sona had given her a rumor. If she had spent 3 weeks carving a clever grave for 18 birds. If Duncan was right. If Morag was right. If kindness and arithmetic and weather were all, in the end, stronger than the stubborn promise she had made at a sickbed. She did not decide anything new down there. The decision had already been made the morning Ewan's hand stopped answering hers. What she did instead was simpler. She let herself feel the full size of the risk, and stayed with it until fear stopped performing and became ordinary. Near dawn, the oldest hen in the flock, a heavy brown bird Mary privately thought of as the widow, stepped down from the perch and walked across the chamber with the slow authority of an animal that has outlived enough to treat drama as wasteful. It stopped beside Mary's knee. Not because it understood anything, because her boot was warm. Mary looked at it in the lamp glow, and laughed, a rough, startled laugh. The first true one since Ewan was alive. The next morning, there were 3 eggs in the far nest box. Still warm. Mary picked up the first one in both hands as if weight might tell her something words could not. It meant the chamber was possible. It meant the season could be argued with. It meant uncertainty was not the same thing as failure. Sona arrived before noon. Mary held out one of the eggs without a word. Sona took it and went very still. 3, Mary said.
Sona swallowed. Then she looked at the chamber door, at the hill, at the sea beyond. There's something I should have told you before. Mary waited.
Would work. The sentence landed softly, which made it hit harder. I thought as much, Mary said. No, Sona said. I mean, I was not certain the story itself was even true. It was 20 years old. It might have been one man's lie to sound clever over supper. It might have been memory gone decorative. For a moment, anger came, thin and fast. 3 weeks of digging, split palms, fear in the dark. All staked on hearsay. Then Mary looked at the egg in Sona's hand. Warm, real, undeniable. If you'd said that at the start, Mary said, I might not have dug. That was my conclusion. Sona looked straight at her. I had a cousin, Mairead, widow, winter of 67. Roads closed before anyone got through. By spring, it was over. I thought ever since that if I had known one useful thing, one real thing, or even one uncertain thing in the right hour, I might have altered the ending. When I saw you after the burial, I could not drive past with silence and call it wisdom. The air between them changed. Mary took the egg back carefully and held it against her palm. I'll give you 1/4 of the winter eggs, she said. Sona shook her head immediately. It isn't charity, Mary said. It's rent for a story that turned out to have a backbone. That was the first week. The second week brought 7 eggs, the third, 9. Then a storm closed the harbor and drove demand up because every above-ground henhouse in the district had gone still. Mary sold 12 to the Brodies, then 24 to the McRaes, then 4 through Morag Dalziel's store, at a price Morag paid without haggling, though the expression on her face suggested she would have liked to argue with the laws of winter themselves. By New Year, Mary had begun a ledger. Date, wind, outside temperature, as best she could judge it, egg count, buyer, price, because records turn stubbornness into proof. Reverend Kerr came in early January with a sack of meal, a tin of dripping, and the look of a man who had been thinking more honestly than usual. He sat at her table instead of standing. That, by itself, told her something was different. Duncan Macaulay called on me, he said. Mary said nothing. He offered the Kirk Building Fund 5 shillings. He suggested I might speak to you again about doing the practical thing. The room went very still. I returned it, Kerr said quickly. Same afternoon. But I'm ashamed it took the money for me to understand the shape of what I had already been helping. I thought I was advising caution. In truth, I was helping clear a path. He reached into his coat and produced a small account book. I've started keeping copies of your sales as I hear of them. Names, dates, prices. In case Duncan tells the factor a different story than the one your eggs are writing. Mary looked at him for a long moment. This was a man who had come to her burial with sincere compassion and bad instincts. Had now done the harder thing and come back with evidence instead of comfort. Thank you, Reverend, she said. He nodded once, relieved and not relieved at all. By mid-January, the island turned vicious. Gales off the Atlantic, snow crusted hard against stone. Boats pulled high and tied twice. One man lost 3 sheep in a drift and found them only when the weather eased enough to smell what had happened. Inside the chamber, the hens kept laying. Not like summer, not recklessly, but steadily, enough to matter. Enough that men who had mocked the very idea of buried hens now sent daughters with baskets and exact coin. Enough that Morag Dalziel came herself one afternoon, climbed down from the cart this time, and said, I need 6 dozen, if you have them. I have 4. I'll take 4 today and 4 next week. Mary packed them in straw and named the price. Higher now. Winter had earned that. Morag counted the coins into her palm, then hesitated. I want to see it, she said. The chamber breathed warm air into the open dusk when Mary lifted the inner canvas and stepped aside. Morag stood at the entrance without speaking. At the hens moving in yellow lamplight. At the thin winter sun still entering by the angled glass. At the whitewashed stones carrying brightness farther than seemed possible. At the fact, undeniable and slightly offensive to everything tidy, that the thing worked. Finally she said, "Next autumn, I'll need measurements." It was not apology. It was more valuable. It was revision. Then came February. And with February, Duncan Macaulay again. Mary had not seen him since before Christmas. She had thought about him the way people think about a fox when the chickens are finally safe for the night. Not present, never absent. She was splitting driftwood beside the house when he rode up alone. No clerk this time. No paper. No borrowed authority. He looked tired. Properly tired. As if winter, for once, had chosen him too. "Mary," he said. She left the axe buried in the chopping block and waited. "The lender in Stornoway has called my note," he said. "I need money before the month turns. I've 15 yards of the east strip adjoining your croft. If you've coin, I'll sell the ewes right and clear your husband's debt inside the same bargain." For a moment she simply looked at him. The man who had stood at Ewan's grave speaking of rent. The man who had brought a clerk to her door. The man who had tried to buy a sermon for 5 shillings. But winter had done its own arithmetic. She went inside, lifted the floorboard, counted out the money from the jar. When she came back, she held the coins in a folded cloth. £2.8 is what Ewan owed you, she said. "I'm not paying you twice. Deduct it. You'll get the rest for the east strip, and we'll write it plain." Duncan gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "Keeping accounts then. Better than some." They stood at the stone boundary and wrote the agreement on a board laid across 2 barrels. Duncan's signature looked smaller than she expected. When it was done, he looked out over the white fields, the stone walls, the low sun, the buried chamber whose south-facing door showed only as a dark cut in the slope. "I thought you were another one," he said. "Another what?" "Another widow who'd be gone by Christmas." Mary folded the paper and tucked it into her coat. "You thought winter only tested people," she said. "It tests prediction, too." He mounted and rode off without answering. By March, the worst of the cold broke. Not suddenly, not mercifully. Just enough to prove it would, eventually, end. The birds were still laying. The ledger was thick now. The jar under the floorboard held more coin than Mary had ever seen gathered in one place that belonged to her. And when Sona came up the hill one bright afternoon with 2 jars of preserved plums wrapped in cloth, she found Mary not merely surviving but planning. "I'm cutting a second chamber in summer," Mary said. "Bigger. I want 30 birds next year." Sona nodded once. Ewan would have liked that. Mary was quiet. It was the first time anyone had said it not as comfort, but as fact. In autumn of 1894, Morag DL sold the harbor store. Her brother wanted her in Aberdeen. Her lungs, she said, were tired of salt. Her exact words to Mary were, "A body can win an argument with weather for years, and still decide not to keep repeating herself." Mary bought the place for cash. Not with inheritance. Not with rescue. With winter eggs. She kept the croft. Kept the chamber. Built the second one. Hired a boy to carry baskets down to the quay each morning. And sold eggs from behind her own counter at prices that made other suppliers sharpen their pencils, and then, slowly, copy her methods instead. On the last evening before she moved fully into the rooms above the store, she went through the till drawers and found a folded slip of paper tucked under the false bottom where Morag kept the better tea. The handwriting was precise enough to be recognized at once. It said, "When the wind says the ground is dead, dig until it loses confidence." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Mary folded the note and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She never told anyone about it. Some things are not secret. They are simply too exact to survive explanation. Sona MacLeod died in the winter of 1901. Mary paid for the stone herself. When the mason asked what words she wanted, she did not deliberate long. Sona MacLeod. She was not certain. She came anyway. There is a photograph of Mary Sinclair taken in 1921 outside Sinclair's stores on the Harbor Road. She is 60. Her hair has gone the color of blown ash. Face has the markings that come not from age alone, but from wind, work, and a long habit of paying close attention to difficult things. She is smiling, not politely, not for the camera. The kind of smile a person wears when she is thinking about something that still pleases her after all the years it took to build it. The caption under the photograph says only, Mary Sinclair, proprietor. It does not say that she buried her husband in peat and stone, and then refused to leave the hill above him. It does not say she dug 7 feet into Hebridean earth and made winter negotiate. It does not say she bought land from the man who tried to pressure her off it, or bought a store from the woman who had once predicted her failure. It does not say anything about Siona, or Reverend Kerr's little notebook, or the first egg in her palm, or the night she sat underground with a lamp and 18 sleeping hens, and let fear finish speaking. Captions can't hold that much. But people remembered. They told it to their children because it answered a question every hard season eventually asks. When the surface has turned against you, when the wind is louder than reason, when the people who call themselves practical have already begun dividing up what they think you're going to lose, is there still something underneath all that, that keeps its own temperature, something not warm enough for comfort, but warm enough for life, warm enough to produce, warm enough to build on, if you are willing to dig until you find it? Mary Sinclair did, and the answer was yes.